There's a photograph that exists in exactly 3 places. One copy sits in the Millbrook County Archives, misfiled under Church Socials, 1958. Another belongs to a woman in Oregon who's never spoken to her siblings since inheriting it. The third was supposedly destroyed in a house fire in 2003, but the grandson swears he still sees it sometimes, just for a moment, in reflections. The photograph shows 17 people standing in front of a white clapboard church on a Sunday morning in October of 1961. 14 of them would be dead within 7 years. But that's not why the photograph matters. It matters because of what's underneath them. What's always been underneath them. What their great-great-grandfather knew about when he poured the foundation, and what his son knew about when he refused to ever step inside, and what the town of Millbrook has spent over a century and a half pretending doesn't exist. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Emerson family arrived in what would become Millbrook, Pennsylvania in 1834. They weren't the first settlers, but they were the first to build something that lasted. Jeremiah Emerson was a lay preacher, a carpenter, and according to his own journals, a man haunted by a very specific kind of faith. Not the warm, communal kind that built barn raisings and quilting circles. The desperate kind. The kind that comes from seeing something you can't explain and needing God to be real enough, powerful enough, to stand between you and it. His journals, housed now in a private collection after his great-great-great-granddaughter sold them in 1998, are difficult to read, not because of the handwriting, though that's challenging enough, but because of what he's trying very carefully not to say. Jeremiah writes around something. He describes choosing the plot of land for his church with unusual specificity. He notes the soil composition, the water table, the bedrock depth. He mentions, almost casually, that local Lenape families avoided this particular hollow. He doesn't say why. He just records that they did. And then he records that he chose it anyway. The church took 14 months to build. This was unusually long for a structure of its size. Jeremiah's journals from this period become more fragmented. He writes about hearing sounds during construction that he attributes to settling wood and shifting earth. He writes about 3 separate workers who left the project without explanation, refusing their final wages. He writes about his wife, Margaret, asking him to choose a different location, and his response that it was too late, that the foundation had already been poured, that God had called them to this specific place. But there's an entry from September of 1835 that stands out. It's brief. The ground moves at night, he writes. Not as an earthquake moves, as something sleeping moves. I have asked the Lord if we are meant to build here. I have received no answer, which I choose to interpret as permission. That last phrase, which I choose to interpret as permission, suggests a man who understood he was doing something questionable, and who needed to frame it as faith rather than hubris or desperation or something darker still. The church was completed in October of 1835. The first service was held on a Sunday morning with 47 people in attendance. Jeremiah's journal entry from that evening is a single sentence. It was quiet, as though he'd expected it not to be. For 23 years, the church functioned as churches do: baptisms, weddings, funerals, Sunday services. The congregation grew to nearly 120 members by the late 1850s. Jeremiah aged into the role of elder statesman, respected and feared in the particular way that men of rigid faith often are. He trained his son, Thomas, in both carpentry and ministry, intending for the boy to inherit both the craft and the calling. But Thomas began refusing to enter the church sometime around his 16th birthday in 1854. There's no dramatic incident recorded, no singular moment of revelation or trauma. Thomas simply stopped going inside. He would stand in the churchyard during services, visible through the windows, present but separate. When questioned by his father, he reportedly said, "I can hear it better from out here." When asked what "it" was, he said nothing else. Jeremiah's journals from this period show increasing frustration with his son, but also something else, a kind of resigned understanding, as though he knew exactly what Thomas meant and wished that he didn't. The church had peculiarities that the congregation learned to accommodate. The floor, though well built and level when laid, developed undulations. Not rot, not structural failure, the wood remained sound. It simply moved. By 1858, there was a noticeable dip near the pulpit, a rise near the back pews. Members learned which floorboards groaned, which ones felt somehow softer underfoot, despite showing no visible damage. They learned not to schedule evening services, because something about the church after dark made people uneasy in ways they couldn't articulate. Children, in the way that children do, developed games and superstitions around the building. They would dare each other to stand in certain spots, to place their palms flat against certain sections of wall. There's a brief mention in a letter from 1860, written by a woman named Sarah Coombs to her sister in Philadelphia, describing her daughter's nightmares after attending Sunday school. She says, "The floor breathes," Sarah wrote. "I told her she's being fanciful, but I confess I have felt it too. A rise and fall, so subtle you think you've imagined it, and then you feel it again." Jeremiah died in the winter of 1861. He was 73 years old. His death was recorded as natural causes, though the doctor's note mentions finding him in the church alone at night, kneeling before the altar, his hands pressed flat against the floor. Thomas refused to hold the funeral service inside the building. He held it in the churchyard instead, in February cold, with his father's coffin resting on frozen ground. When asked why, he said only, "He's close enough already." The congregation found this disrespectful but didn't press the issue. Perhaps because on some level they understood, perhaps because they'd all felt what Thomas had felt, that the church wanted something. That proximity to it, especially in death, meant something other than rest. Thomas Emerson never did become a preacher. He became a farmer instead, married late, had 3 children, but he maintained the church building as his father had wanted. He repaired the roof, replaced broken windows, reinforced the structure. He just did it all from the outside. There are records of him hiring other men to work inside when interior repairs were necessary. He would pay them double the usual rate, and he would wait in the churchyard, watching through the windows, as though standing guard against something, or perhaps guarding against someone staying inside too long. The Civil War came and went. The church remained. Young men from the congregation left for battle. Some came back, some didn't. The ones who returned often requested that their names not be added to the memorial plaque inside the church. They wanted to be remembered, but not there, not in that specific place. The plaque exists today, mounted on the exterior wall instead, a compromise that everyone seemed to understand without needing to discuss why. It was in 1879 that the first explicit incident was recorded. Not in official church records, but in a series of letters between Reverend William Hatch, who had taken over ministerial duties, and a colleague in Harrisburg. Reverend Hatch described what he called a disturbance during evening prayer. 11 people had been present. Halfway through the service, the floor beneath the front pews began to move, not subtly, not the gentle undulation that people had learned to ignore, significantly, visibly, as though something beneath were shifting position. The service ended immediately. The congregants left in what Reverend Hatch described as orderly panic, not running, not screaming, but moving with urgent purpose toward the doors. One woman, elderly and unsteady, fell. 2 men picked her up and carried her. They did not look back. Reverend Hatch remained inside alone for several minutes afterward, describing the experience in his letter with unusual precision. The movement ceased when they left. He wrote, "It was aware of them. I am certain of this. And when I was alone, I felt it aware of me. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply aware, as one might be aware of an insect on one's skin." Thomas Emerson, upon hearing of the incident, came to the church. He stood in the doorway but did not enter. He spoke to Reverend Hatch, who was still inside, from across that threshold. The conversation was witnessed by 2 congregants who had returned to check on the Reverend. Thomas said, "You can't have services after sundown anymore." The Reverend asked why. Thomas responded, "Because it's awake then. My father knew. That's why he stopped." This was the first anyone had heard that Jeremiah had stopped holding evening services. Records confirm that after 1857, all services were held before 4 in the afternoon. No explanation had been given. The congregation had simply accepted the schedule change. The church adapted, morning services only, brief visits for cleaning and maintenance. The building remained central to community identity, but people's relationship with it became increasingly transactional. You used it for what you needed: baptisms, weddings, funerals, and then you left. You didn't linger. You didn't treat it as a gathering place. The social functions moved to homes, to the town hall, to anywhere else. The church became a space you passed through rather than stayed within. And somehow, everyone agreed to this without ever explicitly discussing why. The 20th century brought electricity, automobiles, telephones. Progress arrived in Millbrook as it did everywhere else. But the church remained stubbornly unchanged. Proposals to modernize it, to add electric lighting, to install heating, to renovate the interior, were met with resistance that seemed disproportionate until you understood what people weren't saying. They didn't want to dig deeper into the foundation. They didn't want to disturb what was below. Modernity could wait at the threshold. By the 1930s, the Emerson family's direct involvement with the church had become more complicated. Thomas's son, Robert, had inherited the family obligation but not the family knowledge. Or perhaps he had inherited the knowledge but chosen to interpret it differently. Robert Emerson was a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen horrors explicit and human. Whatever moved beneath the church seemed, to him, manageable by comparison. He began entering the building again. He attended services. He even served briefly on the church council. His wife, Eleanor, did not share his comfort. There's a diary entry from 1937 where she describes watching Robert sleep and wondering what he dreams about after spending time in the church. He says he hears singing, she wrote, not from the congregation, from underneath. He says it's beautiful. He says it makes him feel peaceful. This frightens me more than if he said it terrified him. Fear keeps you careful. Peace makes you careless. The 1940s brought another war, and again young men left. Robert and Eleanor's son, James, enlisted in 1942. He came back in 1946, physically intact, but carrying the particular silence that combat leaves in men. He returned to Millbrook, married a local woman named Patricia, and moved into the old Emerson house. Robert, by then in his 60s, had become increasingly involved with the church. He had started staying late after services, taking walks through the cemetery beside it, talking about the history of the place with a kind of reverence that made people uncomfortable. It was Patricia who first noticed that the church had changed, or rather, that something about it had intensified. She mentioned to Eleanor that the building felt different than it had before the war. Hungrier, she said, and then apologized for the word, saying it sounded foolish. Eleanor didn't tell her it sounded foolish. Eleanor said, "It comes in cycles. Every 20 years or so, it gets more active. Then it settles again." When Patricia asked why, Eleanor said, "I don't know if it's something about time, or if it's something about how many dead are buried near it. The cemetery has grown." Perhaps that matters. The cemetery had indeed grown. Generations of Millbrook families rested there now. The church stood at the center of an expanding constellation of graves, and if you looked at the burial records, you'd notice something unusual. People were buried as close to the church as space allowed, but never directly behind it. The area immediately behind the building, despite being prime burial ground, remained empty. This wasn't due to any official policy. No church record forbade it. Families simply chose other spots. When asked, they would say things like, "The ground isn't right there," or "It doesn't feel proper," and no one questioned this. The empty space behind the church grew more conspicuous as the cemetery filled, a deliberate absence that everyone participated in maintaining. The 1950s brought prosperity and a kind of determined normalcy to Millbrook. The town grew. New families arrived. The church, now over a century old, was considered a historic landmark. Tourists occasionally stopped to photograph it. Local historians wrote brief mentions of it in county guidebooks. None of these accounts mentioned anything unusual. They described a charming example of pre-Civil War religious architecture. They noted the Emerson family's long stewardship. They praised the building's remarkable preservation. But the people who actually attended services there knew better. By 1958, the morning-only rule had become so ingrained that newer members didn't even know it had once been different. They simply knew that services ended by noon, that the building was locked by 1 in the afternoon, that weddings were scheduled for late morning and funerals for early morning, and no one ever questioned why. The church had become a place governed by unspoken agreements, by inherited caution passed down through generations like a genetic memory of danger. Robert Emerson died in 1959. He died inside the church. They found him on a Tuesday morning, lying on his back in the center aisle, his arms spread wide as though he were making a snow angel on the wooden floor. The coroner ruled it a heart attack. He was 78 years old, and heart attacks happen. But his face was peaceful in a way that disturbed the people who saw him. Not the peace of death, the peace of surrender, of finally giving in to something he'd been resisting or negotiating with for years. James, his son, inherited the full weight of the family legacy. He was 41 years old. He had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, and he made a decision that broke a century and a quarter of Emerson tradition. He sold the family house. He moved his family to the other side of Millbrook, as far from the church as the town boundaries allowed. When asked why, he cited practical reasons. The old house needed too much work. His wife wanted something more modern. But Patricia told her sister the truth. "James has nightmares," she said. "He dreams he's underground, and something is holding him, and it feels like love. He wakes up crying. We had to leave. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" The church continued without Emerson oversight for the first time in its history. The denomination appointed a board of trustees. They were all local people, all long-time members of the congregation. They knew the rules even if they didn't know the reasons. Morning services. Lock the doors by early afternoon. Don't schedule anything after dark. Don't dig near the foundation. Don't ask too many questions about the empty space behind the building. The church persisted through careful ritual, through inherited caution, through a collective agreement to maintain traditions whose origins had been forgotten or suppressed. But something changed in 1961. Perhaps it was the absence of Emerson blood making decisions. Perhaps it was simply time, another cycle completing itself. The floor began moving during daytime services, not dramatically, but noticeably. Hymn books would slide slightly. People standing would feel the subtle shift beneath their feet. And then there were the sounds. Not singing, as Robert had described, something else. A low vibration that you felt more than heard, that made your teeth ache and your chest tighten. It came from beneath the floor, from whatever had always been beneath the floor. And it was getting louder. October of 1961. That's when the photograph was taken. The one that exists in 3 places, or 2 places, or maybe just 1 place and 2 memories. It was Church Anniversary Sunday, celebrating 126 years since the building's completion. 17 people posed for the photograph on the front steps. The photographer was a man named Donald Price, a professional from the county seat brought in to document the occasion. He took 3 shots. The first 2 showed nothing unusual. The third, the one that survived in those 3 copies, showed something that Donald Price noticed immediately. He said the ground beneath the church moved while he was setting up the shot, not the earth around it, specifically the ground beneath the foundation, as though something had shifted position in the space between the bedrock and the wooden floor. He said he could see the building settle, just slightly, as though adjusting to accommodate new weight distribution below. The people in the photograph are smiling. They didn't feel it. Or they did feel it and had learned to ignore it so thoroughly that their faces showed nothing. Donald Price said he felt sick looking through the viewfinder. He took the 3rd shot and left. He developed the photographs and delivered them and never came back to Millbrook. What happened to those 17 people is a matter of public record, though the records are scattered across different counties, different states. 3 died in 1962, 2 in 1963, 4 in 1964. By 1968, only 3 of the 17 remained alive. The causes of death varied: cancer, car accidents, heart failure, a drowning, a fall, a house fire. Nothing connected them except the photograph and the church, and the fact that all of them, according to family members, experienced the same phenomenon in the weeks before they died. They said the floor in their homes felt wrong, Not unstable, just wrong. As though it were moving in that same subtle way the church floor moved, as though whatever was beneath the church had learned to follow them home. Several of them mentioned dreams of being underground, of earth pressing against their faces, of something vast and patient waiting just below the surface of their daily lives. One woman, Sarah Brennan, told her daughter that she could hear singing at night. Beautiful singing. Coming from beneath her bedroom floor, she said it made her want to dig. To pull up the floorboards and dig down until she found the source. She died 2 weeks later. Stroke. She was 53 years old. James Emerson heard about the deaths. Everyone in Millbrook heard about them. The town is small enough that patterns become visible whether you want to see them or not. But James didn't speak publicly about it. He kept his distance from the church. Attended services at a Methodist congregation in the next town over. His children grew up knowing their family had some connection to the old church, but not understanding what kind of connection or why it mattered. The eldest daughter, Caroline, asked him once why they never went there. He told her, "Because we got out, and you don't go back to something you got out of." By 1969, only 2 of the 17 from the photograph remained alive. The church board made a decision. They would close the building for structural assessment. Officially, this was due to concerns about the foundation. Unofficially, it was because people were afraid. Not of dying, death comes for everyone eventually, but of what came before the dying, the dreams, the movement, the sense of being claimed by something that had been waiting beneath their feet for their entire lives. The church closed in March of 1969. The last service held there was attended by 11 people. The hymns were sung quickly. No one lingered afterward. They locked the doors and walked away, and for the first time in 134 years, the building stood empty. The church has stood empty for over 50 years now. Technically, it's still owned by the denomination, held in a kind of administrative limbo. There have been proposals to renovate it, to turn it into a museum, to sell it to private buyers. None of these proposals ever advance beyond preliminary discussion. The reasons given are always practical cost, liability, lack of interest. But the real reason is that no one wants to be responsible for what happens if they disturb it, if they open it, if they dig into that foundation and find out what Jeremiah Emerson knew in 1835. The building has weathered remarkably well for a structure that's been abandoned for 5 decades. The roof should have collapsed. The windows should have broken. Weather and time should have reduced it to ruins. But it stands. The paint has faded, but the boards remain sound. The door is still locked with the same lock from 1969, and occasionally someone from the county comes to check on it, to make sure vandals haven't broken in, to verify that it's still structurally intact. These inspections are always conducted quickly. The inspectors rarely go inside. When they do, they don't stay long. There are stories, of course. Teenagers claim to have heard things at night, humming from beneath the floorboards. Movement inside when the building should be empty, lights in the windows despite there being no electricity. Most of these stories are probably exaggeration or fabrication, probably. But there are enough of them, repeated consistently enough over decades, that dismissing all of them requires its own kind of faith. The faith that old buildings are just old buildings, that ground is just ground, that the past stays buried simply because we want it to. James Emerson died in 2007. He was 85 years old. He never went back to the church. His children sold the remaining family property in Millbrook and scattered across the country. Caroline, the eldest daughter, kept some of her great-great-great-grandfather's journals, the ones that hadn't been sold off in the 90s. She's never published them. She's never even shown them to historians. When asked why, she says, "Because some things shouldn't be remembered. Some knowledge shouldn't be preserved. My family spent generations keeping people away from something. I'm not going to be the one who invites them back." The last of the 17 people from the photograph died in 2012. His name was Martin Hughes. He'd moved to Oregon in 1970, put as much distance between himself and Millbrook as possible while remaining in the continental United States. He told his children that he'd survived by leaving, by cutting all connection to the place. But in his final months, according to his daughter, he started talking about the church again. He said he could feel it. That distance didn't matter, that it had always been patient, and now it was simply waiting for him to come home. He said the floor in his hospice room moved at night. The nurses noticed it too, but attributed it to settling foundation or seismic activity. Oregon has earthquakes. Buildings shift. There are always rational explanations if you need them badly enough. The church still stands in Millbrook. You can drive past it if you're ever in that part of Pennsylvania. It's on Hollow Road, about 2 miles outside the main part of town. There's no historical marker, no sign identifying it as the Emerson family church. Just a white clapboard building surrounded by a cemetery where the dead are buried everywhere except directly behind it. The door is locked. The windows are intact, and if you stand there quietly, if you're there at the right time and no one seems to agree on when the right time is, you might feel it. That subtle movement beneath your feet, that sense of something vast and patient turning slowly in the dark beneath you. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply aware. The way it's always been aware. The way it will continue to be aware long after the building finally falls and the cemetery is reclaimed by forest and the town of Millbrook is a footnote in some future historian's research. Jeremiah Emerson wrote, in one of his final journal entries before his death, a single line that Caroline has never shared publicly but confirmed exists. "I did not build on it," he wrote. "I built for it." Whether he meant that as confession or justification or simple statement of fact, we'll never know. But the church still stands, and whatever is beneath it has never stopped moving. Thank you for watching.